Good afternoon. My name is Julia Damchek, and I will be your webinar host and moderator today. Welcome to our monthly Northwood Alumni and Friends webinar. Today, our topic is how the Declaration of Independence shaped America. Just a few reminders. Please place any questions you might have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we will be recording the webinar and emailing it out to all participants along with a survey probably tomorrow morning. So be on the lookout for that. And let's get started. So this year, America celebrates its 250th birthday, and we date the birthday from the signing of this document. Many people confuse the Declaration with the Constitution, so I'm going to draw a simple distinction today. The Declaration established the ends of our government, the purposes it must serve, and the Constitution defined the means by which we would pursue them. The Constitution was always provisional, subject to amendment as circumstances required, but the Declaration was something different, a permanent statement of principles meant to guide every generation of Americans that followed. It's been called the American Creed, the beliefs that hold us together as a nation regardless of our differences. Margaret Thatcher put it well. England is a product of history, and America is a product of philosophy. Here we are, 250 years later. Those ideas have been tried and tested through war, crisis, and transformation. How have they shaped our politics, our culture, and our economy? And how well have we lived up to the promise of that founding philosophy? To help us answer those questions, we have assembled a distinguished panel today, including Dr. Michael Makovi. Michael Makovi received his PhD in agricultural and applied economics from Texas Tech in 2020 and has since served as an assistant professor in economics here at Northwood University. His research examines the foundations of economic thought, including the intriguing question of why Karl Marx's economic ideas remain popular despite their broad rejection by professional economists. And Dr. Glenn Moots. Glenn Moots is a professor and chair of political science and philosophy here at Northwood. He has been a visiting fellow at Princeton University and the Huntington Library and has received research support from the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, the Acton Institute, and the Institute for Humane Studies. He is the author of Politics Reformed, The Anglo-American Legacy of Covenant Theology, and co-editor of Justifying Revolution, Law, Virtue, and Violence in the American War of Independence. He holds advanced degrees from Louisiana State, Walsh College, and the University of Michigan. And finally, Dr. Brett Decker. Brett Decker holds the endowed chair of leadership at Northwood University and is a New York Times best-selling author. He has served as an editorial page editor of the Washington Times and Asian culture and thought editor at the Wall Street Journal, and has written for 2 U.S. presidents. His commentary has been recognized by the BBC as among the world's best, and he has received the Amnesty International Award for Human Rights Reporting. He holds degrees from Albion College, Johns Hopkins, Notre Dame, the U.S. Naval War College, and the University of Southern California. Okay, without any further ado, I'm going to hand this panel or these questions over to these 3 gentlemen, and they will answer these questions for y'all. So, first question. The Declaration says that equality and the right to liberty were self-evident truths. What does this mean, and why these words? I'm going to start with you, Dr. Makovi.
So I think the claim is self-evident because any other claim is absurd, or at least any other claim would be much harder to justify and would require some special justification. If people don't own their own bodies, who does own them? Like it's kind of intuitive that a person should own your own body. If you say the king owns your body, well then okay, why does the king own my body? Who's the king? Why the king of my country, not the king of a different country? What if the country gets conquered by another country? Does that king now own me? Whereas if you say I own myself, okay, that's, pretty self-evident, pretty clear. The burden of proof lies with the person who thinks, that has the more exceptional claim. Possession is 9/10 of the law. So in general, we would assume a person has the right to live their life as they want, do what they want. I mean, I would say in general, a person has the right to do literally anything they want until proven why you shouldn't have the right to do some particular thing. There was a great expression of this. The leveler Richard Rumbold, facing execution in 1685 in England, said, "I am sure there was no man born marked of God above another, for none comes into the world with a saddle on his back, nor any booted and spurred to ride him." So, and that at the time was considered, a revolutionary claim, hence his execution. But I think that's, self-evident claim that no one has a saddle and no one has the boots to get to ride them.
Dr. Decker, you wanna share
Sure.
your thoughts?
I think one of the key takeaways of the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness being self-evident truths is it's kind of a shot across the bow in the world at the time, 1776, kind of making this declaration that the balance of power in a system of government is different than how a lot of those in power wanted to characterize it. So this balance of power, because we're people, because we're human beings, we're infused with these rights given by God, given by Creator, however people want to look at it. It just by being an individual, we have these rights. They're not given to us by a government. We don't have to rely on a government to allow us to do things. We have these rights of our own, and it's government that has to respond to us, right? So it's sort of this reminder that for a government, a republic, or whatever government you have, its power base is consent of the governed, including what people are allowed to do and not allowed to do is agreement of the people. It's not just by fiat someone decides on a whim arbitrarily what we can and can't do. We're the ones that decide that, and I think that for me is kind of this enduring point of how these truths are self-evident.
Thank you, Dr. Moots. You can take over.
Thanks, Julie, and hi to my students. I had a couple students text me this morning, well, former students who texted me this morning, said they were looking forward to this, so greetings to them. Also, I'm excited that I get to wear my Minuteman tie. This is actually from Lord and Taylor, 1976. I was not tying my own ties in 1976, but I found this tie, and there it is. I'm going to go to Jefferson because Jefferson is asked later in his life about the Declaration as they're celebrating the 50 year. And Jefferson says that the Declaration is, first, he says it's a statement of the common sense of the matter. He says that it is the American sentiment. In other words, it was something broadly agreed to. And he also says that his sources were what he calls the elementary books of public right. And in that list of the elementary books of public right, he cites Aristotle, Cicero, and Locke. So, that's a pretty big time frame. I think what Jefferson is saying is it was something that was broadly agreed to at the time, and also that it was something that had been broadly agreed to among those who thought about these things. In other words, if you were to take a survey of the most important authors on political thinking, you would find that they agree on this point. And I think then for Jefferson, that becomes axiomatic. And if you remember geometry, you know that when you're starting a proof, you have to start with something. You can't start with nothing. So you have to have these axioms. And I think for Jefferson, this is axiomatic. In other words, there's no way to engage in political thinking without having certain truths that are self-evident. And I'll say one more thing on this, which is in relation to Michael's point, that quote about men not being born with saddles on their backs and others being born with boots and spurs to ride them. That's actually repeated by Jefferson when he reflects on the Declaration. So that's another point that demonstrates the tradition And the historical nature of the point is him going back to that sentiment from the English Civil War.
All right. Thank you very much. All right, Dr. Decker, I'm going to start with you this time.
Uh-oh.
The United States has changed a lot and grown a lot since 1776. What were some times you could point to when the Declaration of Independence served as a guide inspiration for Americans as they navigated all of the changes over the last 250 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it gets to this point of how important the Declaration and the Constitution are sort of as aspirational documents. This idea that we're a country that is always trying to become better. So even at the founding of the country, we had this big, right, unsolved question about slavery that, right, it took a war, it took 600,000 deaths. The founders were very obvious about this. We don't have an answer to this right now, but let's get started because we have a great idea and we don't want to miss the opportunity. So I think throughout American history, this always it's kind of like the echo in the back, a whisper in the back of our head. Hey, don't forget who you are. And it's sort of this idea of constantly becoming better. And if you look at all the trouble we've had sort of over the last 250 years, Americans have this amazing ability to self-correct. Even if you look at the average election, doesn't matter which side you're on. If your side wins, the president wins. Usually, a president comes in with both houses of Congress, right? So, yay, let's do everything we want to do. Or, oh no, the other guys won. We're gonna get wiped out. But what does the electorate do? The electorate usually, almost always in every midterm, takes away at least one house of Congress. They're like, okay, you have too much power. Let's hedge that a little. So it's this pendulum swing that I think the American character, so based on these ideas of our founding, are like, okay, let's try to keep things in the middle somehow. So it's this self-correcting idea. I think what we have to be worried about now is if the system still works, if the system is broken or not. Nancy Pelosi, when she was Speaker of the House after they rammed Obamacare through over the Christmas break, a reporter asked her, where in the Constitution can you force people to buy health insurance? And she laughed and she said, are you serious? Are you serious? Why would the Constitution have anything to do with this major piece of legislation? So I think what we have to ask ourselves is, it got us this far. Can the Declaration and these founding principles continue to keep us together going forward? And I think at this anniversary, this birthday of our country, I think that's what we need to be worried about and focused on, sort of ensuring continues to exist.
Thank you. Dr. Makovi, I'll hand that one over to you.
So yeah, my first pick would have been the abolition of slavery. So I'll pick another. I think the much wrongly reviled Lochner era of Supreme Court jurisprudence. So the case of Lochner v. New York is considered the start of what's called the Lochner era of the Supreme Court. That there were a lot of decisions that followed that one that were similar. And what Lochner v. New York said was that people have certain economic liberties independent of their political or civil liberties, and that those rights are inherent in the 14th Amendment, because the 14th Amendment refers to the rights of the people, but it doesn't say what those rights are. Similarly, the 9th Amendment says that the rights listed in the Bill of Rights are not meant to be all-inclusive, and they're not meant to disparage any rights that are not listed. So there's this understanding that we have all sorts of rights, more rights than we can possibly list, and that the Declaration or the Bill of Rights only listed the rights that were relevant at the time, but they weren't meant to include all rights. So specifically with that case, overruled was a law that limited working hours of people in bakeries. And often people look at the progressive era and say, oh, look, this is great. They were passing labor legislation to protect people's rights, limit working hours. And, this evil Lochner v. New York overturned this law. And so a few decades later, when the Lochner era ended, government regulation of labor tended to become more accepted, and the Supreme Court would accept it. People say, oh, look, the progressive era, prevailed at last. But if you look at what the regulation was actually meant to do, it was actually meant to discriminate against some workers in favor of others. With Lochner, what happened was you tended to have native-born Americans would work in bakeries in shifts, whereas immigrants would tend to work all day long, but they would take a nap. They would basically like make the dough, let it rise, take a nap while the dough was rising, and then they would bake it later in the day. So by limiting the working hours, the intention was to force immigrants out of the labor market and reserve jobs for native-born Americans. Similarly, part of the progressive movement was, for example, women's minimum wages. And they were explicit at the time, the purpose of putting a minimum wage on women was to make it so that it was less attractive to hire them. They explicitly said this will force women to stay home and be, quote, mothers to the race. It was explicitly eugenic and explicitly misogynistic. So there's actually a work called Illiberal Reformers about many of the ways in which progressive era legislation was actually intended to be eugenic and racist. So what I think was interesting about Lochner's, again, considered one of the most reviled cases of Supreme Court jurisprudence. But I think actually they got it right. They understood people have economic rights as well as political rights. You don't just have the right to vote. You also have the right to make a contract to work on terms of your choosing, free of government interference. I know I'm talking a lot, but David Bernstein has a book called Rehabilitating Lochner, and he points out that basically at the time, due process of law was understood not just to mean the process of law, like did it go through the legislature, did you get a fair trial, but the phrase of law was understood to mean that people have certain rights. Like you often see like people in American history, especially in like the American Revolution, saying things like Parliament has violated the law. And today people are like, what does that mean? How can Parliament violate the law? They passed the law. But at the time people said, no, there are laws that exist above Parliament. And or as people like Augustine or Aquinas said, an unjust law is no law at all. So people had this understanding. I think Lochner v. New York, which at the time people understood that a law was something above what the government says. We have certain rights. We have rights to produce what we want, work where we want, make contracts what we want. And often government attempts to violate those rights might be said to be in the name of some social justice, but often it's made in the name of discriminating in favor of one group against a different group. And I think we should rehabilitate Lochner.
Thank you, Dr. Makovi. Glenn Moots, we can wrap this question up with you.
Yeah. So there are some, again, I'm going to go back to history here. There are some significant points in American history. I'm not an historian, by the way. I don't even play one on TV. But the Declaration is used by the abolitionists in the early 19th century. Frederick Douglass refers to it with admiration in addressing the race question. Lincoln refers to it, of course, very famously. It's referred to in the women's suffrage movement, and it's prominent in the civil rights era. And of course, Dr. King draws from it. So now what's interesting about that, and I'm going to go back to Michael's point about law, is the Declaration comes up when certain constitutional questions are raised. And if you think about the beginnings of American independence in 1765, I mean, you can argue that there are things that go back before that, but really what the Americans, I'll say the colonists and the Britons had, was a dispute over the Constitution and dispute over the law. You quoted earlier, Julie Margaret Thatcher, that America was created by a philosophy. I don't know that I would want to be governed by a philosophy, but I would want to be governed by a law that was informed by a philosophy. And so when Americans run up against philosophical questions within the law, one place they go, of course, is the Bill of Rights. And maybe that's a subject for another day. But what's interesting is that there are other countries within this Anglo or British tradition of law, and their rights have not been preserved nearly as much as ours have. I mean, if you look at a lot of the rights that that people used to enjoy, say in Australia or Britain or Canada, they're gone. And so you think, well, how is it that our constitutional questions turned in a different way than theirs did when questions of speech or privacy or property or firearms or things like that came up? And I think it's important that we think about the Declaration as something that is still living and still informing the way we think about rights and liberty.
Thank you, Dr. Moots. I'm going to start with you on this next question. Many people today describe our politics as polarized, with fierce disagreement about the proper role of government on the right and the left. Does the Declaration provide common ground that Americans on both sides can agree on, or have these principles themselves become a source of contention? Or is it possible we have grown out of the Declaration of Independence so that its ideas no longer apply in the same way?
I think if the Declaration of Independence is not rooted in a good understanding of human nature, then at some point it becomes obsolete because we have a new understanding of human nature. But if human nature doesn't change and the understanding of it is right, then no, we don't grow out of it. And then I know there are a lot of voices on the right and the left that feel as though we should move forward. By the way, Michael referred to the progressive era, and I think that idea of being progressive, which is just one of the worst eras in American government and legal thinking. I think every time we think we're going to get beyond something in the past, we're going to get rid of the old ways, I really think we're in trouble. So I'm hoping, to Brett's point earlier about America self-correcting, I hope what we can bring ourselves to, both on the right and the left, is a reappreciation of those principles, those enduring principles from our founding.
Thank you, Dr. Moots. Dr. Makovi, I'll hand it over to you.
So, so I don't know that we can all agree on the principles of the Declaration. I don't know if that can be common ground, but I think it certainly should be common ground. We should be able to all agree on that. I think one of the phenomena we see is that the more people ask the government to do, the more political conflict we have. Because the more the government is involved, you're going to have some disagreement over what that thing is. I mean, the example I give is, like, if we all voted on like which car we should all drive, I think the Ford F-150 is like the #1 best-selling vehicle. Okay, so the Ford F-150 wins. Everyone in America must drive a Ford F-150. Well, clearly a lot of people are going to be unhappy with that. Instead, what do? We let there be a free market. You can buy whatever car you want, and now we don't all have to, have a fight between Fox News and the other media. Oh, those evil liberals all want you to drive a Prius. Oh, those evil conservatives all want you to drive a pickup truck. But just imagine if we did all vote on what car. The more we let individual people choose for themselves and exercise their own rights, both political and economic, the less conflict we have. Now, it doesn't mean that we can have, an anarchy with no government at all. Maybe there are certain things the government does need to do, but the less you ask the government to do, the better it'll do those things that you ask it to do. The more you ask it to do, the more it's going to do a bad job of it and create unnecessary conflict. So I think if anything, we need to accept even more of the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution. We need to accept more individual rights and limitation of government. I think, the attempts of, separation of powers and checks and balances, for example, in the Constitution has not always worked. The answer is not, oh, well, it didn't work, so let's get rid of it and have, say, a unified, government with no checks and balances. We need more checks and balances. I've thought of things like, for example, what if we had, say, the Senate was originally elected by the states, not by the people, so 2 senators per state. Typically, when you have a one person wins a district, you get a 2-party system. What if then the House, let's say it was proportional. Let's say we had a proportional House where the entire country votes and each party gets proportionally how many votes it got. Well, typically proportional systems result in multiple parties, not just 2 parties. So imagine how much more checks and balances there would be if, say, the Senate, you had Republicans and Democrats, and in the House, you had a set of like 5 or 10 different political parties. That would make it, whether that would work or not, that's not my point. Is we should think of more interesting ways of how can we have more checks and balances? How can we have more limitation of government? How can we protect individual rights more? How can we take all those principles further?
Thank you, Dr. Makovi, and Dr. Decker. It's yours.
For the record, my vote is that everyone should drive a Porsche 911 and we should get rid of speed limits, but that might get kind of expensive. This question of if we've sort of outgrown the Declaration of Independence, my worry is that maybe we did a long time ago. If you look at history, especially the example which we're always drawing with the Roman Republic, it ceased to be a republic as it became an empire. And this question, if you look at Washington, how much he in his farewell address, he never gave it, it was his farewell letter, but he gave this big warning on permanent entangling alliances and foreign wars. And John Quincy Adams later warned us about, running around the world looking for monsters to slay or something like that. I think the question is at World War II, at the end of World War II, during World War II, maybe even the Spanish-American War, do we start to transition out of this Republican era into sort of a more imperial one? And I think that's the question is, are we so bogged down in, say, running the world that these ideas of individual rights, individual liberties, a government that lives within its bounds is really no longer realistic? Have we transitioned out of this kind of quaint idea? And that's kind of what I worry about, is maybe we're there. There was this really interesting debate in 1898 around the Spanish-American War about whether we should be acquiring colonies like Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines. And Mark Twain came up and said, no, this is exactly what we're not supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be this idea that others emulate. We can't subject or force other people to be democracies. We need to show them by the power of example, this is a better way to be. And I think that's the question we have to keep asking ourselves is, are we trying to force a world to be something instead of showing them what it should be? And I think that's what the Declaration reminds us how we should move forward.
Okay, that's the end of our questions. I do have some questions from the audience, and I'll read those to you guys. You guys can just answer them as you please. First one comes from Northwood alumnus, Quentin Lott. Hi, Quentin. He's asking, if the Declaration of Independence provides the creed for generations, do you see a contradiction with civil rights, natural rights, and personal rights?
I'll take a swing at it. I think that civil rights are informed by natural rights. So in other words, the law is informed by what we would call the natural law or reason, which is actually back to your first question. And then personal rights are enjoyed because they're civil rights. In other words, the law protects and enables the exercise of your rights. So I think they're all aligned. They shouldn't, rightly understood, be in conflict.
I think an important aspect of this is to remember, further to the first question you asked, is what is the source of our rights to begin with? And it's not government bestowing them on us. If you look, you have to be careful of supposed good intentions, right? Like the New Deal, look how much FDR expanded the federal government, or Lyndon Johnson's so-called Great Society. Supposedly, the idea was to give people a step up, make society more fair. But what did it actually do? It actually created sort of this permanent dependent underclass. So, we need to get government out of the way, let people sort of do things on their own instead of thinking government's the answer. And I think especially as far as civil rights, sometimes government needs to step in. Most of the time it needs to step out of the way.
So I would say in general, no, I don't see a contradiction. I think like Milton Friedman has a great, it's the first chapter too of Capitalism and Freedom, where he talks about political rights and economic rights are both part and parcel of one thing, and that you can't have one without the other. The example he gives is, for example, you can't have freedom of speech without private ownership of the printing press. Like if the government owns all the printing presses, for example, what kind of freedom of speech is like? We can see that, for example, in Hungary. with Viktor Orban, they still had elections, but over the past 16 years, Orban basically took over the media, made them all state media until, okay, great, you have elections, but there's basically one party and you can't really say anything against the party. Like, you're not going to, go to jail or get your head chopped off if you speak against the government. But hey, if all the media, if all the TV stations and newspapers are owned by the government, who's going to speak against the government? I do think one thing we need to distinguish is political rights from human rights. So we have this weird thing where people nowadays seem to think like you have an inherent God-given right to vote, but you don't have a right to say own your own business or buy and sell what you want. So you have this weird dynamic of if you infringe a person's ability to vote, this is the worst travesty. But if the government regulates, some product or business out of existence or taxes something out of existence, oh, well, that's democracy. That's this. I'd say if anything, you should be the other way around. Like I am more concerned with my ability to buy and sell and live my life freely than to be able to vote. Like if I had to pick one or the other, I'd rather be able to buy a house and live in it and vote than say be able to vote but not be able to buy a house. So, and also if you think like if you're on a desert island or if you are, say, in a society with no government, you still have your human rights to buy and sell and live, but you don't have a right to vote if there's no government in existence. So the right to vote, as important as it is human creation. We've created the idea of voting. We've created the idea of democracy, and we could imagine hypothetically alternative forms of government that maybe don't have voting. But the idea that you have the right to live your own life and buy and sell what you want, live where you want, work where you want, have the kind of family that you want, that is something that exists with or without government prior to government. So I don't really see a contradiction. I think maybe there's a hierarchy. And I think the economic rights that people have, and again, economic rights, I think are basically all rights, because ultimately, as Friedman's point was, like the right to speak is also like the right to write words. But the right to write words on paper is essentially the right to own a pen and paper and do with your pen and paper what you want to do. So ultimately, I think all human rights are part and parcel of each other.
All right, we've got 3 more questions, all coming from Malata. Hi, Malata. So we'll have each of you just take one of them. So you guys pick who wants one here. First one, if the Declaration of Independence shifted the source of sovereignty from the crown to the individual, to what extent did this decentralization of power serve as the essential prerequisite for the American Industrial Revolution? And is that link being eroded by modern regulatory shifts? Anyone?
I'm going to let Michael take it.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. So I think, I'll say the American Industrial Revolution is highly debated about exactly what caused it, but at least one prominent argument for how it happened was that basically the more you do let people be free, the more you have economic rights, protect private property, and the more you decentralize power, the more you have individual people trying out their own ideas. And it's just out of this millions of people each trying lots of very small little ideas, you get economic growth. And no one planned this. Like no one in 1776 thought, oh, by establishing the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, we're going to have an industrial revolution. So I think a great source on this is Deirdre McCloskey. So she wrote this huge 3-volume book, but it's been summarized in a book called Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich by Deirdre McCloskey and Art Carden. And basically the argument is that, by letting people alone, by letting them be individual free, we let 1,000 ideas bloom and we get this massive unleashment of human creativity. And
Thank
the
you.
more we don't do that.
Yeah. The opposite. Okay. The Wealth of Nations was published in 1776, the same year as the Declaration. Do you believe the timing was a coincidence, or if there was a shared intellectual DNA between the Scottish Enlightenment and the American founders? Dr. Makovi, is that you again? Or
Brett?
somebody else?
Brett, you want
Brett?
I think one of the remarkable things about the founding era, especially in this country, is you had all these brilliant people who didn't agree on everything, but they're all at the same place at the same time. And I think you had this sort of you had this kind of germination of these like great ideas that sort of were sprouting up. I think it's also important though to realize this is kind of the culmination of thought that had been developing since the Middle Ages, as far as um, how do you control the rulers or the governors? How do you put checks and balances on the people that are over us? Right, the Magna Carta, right, started to rein in powers of the king, and this is really just kind of where it peaked at this time. So I think you had a lot of different Enlightenment ideas, some good, some bad. Right, the French Revolution had some similar founding principles, but went crazy mass murdering everybody, right? So I think there is some definite overlap between the Wealth of Nations and the Declaration, but I think you can draw on a lot of other documents around the same time, and look at where there's confluence or divergence as well. But I think what makes America special, how all these people with different priorities and ideas um, came up with a compromise that could work and has lasted 250 years. And we'll see. Do we have 250 more? Let's see.
Thank you. Okay, final question. The Declaration argues that rights are unalienable and endowed by a creator rather than granted by the state. From an economic perspective, does this inherent sanctity of the individual make a truly free market a moral necessity rather than just an efficient policy choice?
I guess that's me. Well, um, I don't want to say, I mean, a truly free market is kind of a loaded statement. So, is it absolutely free? No. And again, that's where the question of rights comes in, and that's often what legal questions turn on. So I think again, it's the start of the conversation to talk about individuals having rights that are prior to the government. But I think if one understands the government as something created to preserve those rights and rightly executed, in fact, does much better than we would have rights without a government, then I think it's just a matter of working that out, and that's usually what constitutional legal questions turn on. So I guess I want to align those ideas rather than have them be a kind of binary where the state is always the enemy of rights, which is not the case.
All right. Well, thank you again. That wraps up our webinar for today. I want to thank you, Dr. Moots, Dr. Decker, and Dr. Makovi, for taking time out of your busy days to join us today. And thank you to everyone online for joining us today. We're going to take the summer off, and we'll be back in the fall. Our first webinar will be with Northwood President, Dr. Kent McDonald. And again, thank you for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.